Hello, my name is Brian Zanti. I'm with the Turing School of Software and Design. And today we are going to be starting our setlist app in our Mod 2 backend engineering program. So let's get right into it. So the first thing that we're going to need to do to create this app is run Rails new. So this command is going to set up our app for us. We do want to make sure before we do that we are on the proper version of Rails. So we're on Rails version 5.2.5, and then if we do Ruby-V, we're on version 2.7.2. So those are Ruby and Rails versions. You want to make sure that you get your Rails versions installed before, your Ruby and Rails installed before moving forward. So I've got those two installed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do Rails and then underscore 5.2.5 to say I want to make sure I'm using this specific version of Rails. Now, I don't need to do that because it already picks up my version as 5.2.5, but it's good to be explicit here. So we want a Rails version 5.2.5. We're creating a new app, and then we're going to tell it what the name of our app is. So this is going to be called setlist. We are going to add some other options here. So we're going to add -T. This is going to skip installing Minitest. We are not going to use Minitest as our testing framework. Instead, we're going to use RSpec. And then the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add in --database equals PostgreSQL. By default, Rails would set up a SQLite database. We want to be using a Postgres database. Two more options here. We're going to add in skip Spring and skip turbo links. Without going into too much detail, these are two features of Rails that would help us if we were developing an enterprise level application, but really don't help us too much in terms of learning about Rails. And it just kind of, it can really make debugging certain things difficult. So it's good to just take these out if you don't need them, and we don't need them for Mod 2. So you'll see that Rails is installing a lot of gems. So there are a lot of gems. There's a lot of code that we're going to need that we didn't necessarily write, and Rails is going through and installing all those things. So you can see Sass Rails, Tilt, Sass, Rails, Sprockets, FFI, all of these things that Rails is going to need to install to work. So now that our Rails new command has finished, if we do an ls, I've got some other things in my classwork directory here, but I should see setlist right here. And it looks like I had another version, which we're not going to use. We're going to use this version here. So when I ran Rails new, it created this new app for me. And let's go ahead and open it up. And what we'll see when we look at everything in this directory is that Rails sets up a lot for us just with the Rails new command. So we've got all of these directories here. And then if we open up some of them, we can see that there's a lot of directories in those directories. Yeah, so a lot of things that Rails new is going to do for us. So I've just created a lot of files and folders. I'm going to add everything here. And I'm going to, actually, before I commit it, I want to do a git branch -m to rename this branch to main. And I think I actually want to do a git reset first, and then a git status. Let's do git branch -m main here. No, it's not going to let me do that. Okay, let's add everything first. So if I do git status, I can see all of these new files that I've added. And so now I'll go ahead and commit them. And I'll say this is my initial commit. And now let's try branch -m main. And there we go. You can see my my branch name changed from master to main here. And if I do a git status, I should see it's on branch main. So now I have set up this Rails app, done the initial setup, and we should be ready to go. All right. So the next thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to add some more gems. So I'm going to open up this gem file here, and this is going to be a lot of where I can put additional gems that I want to have installed. And so I'm going to add in gem pry into here. So I'm going to use pry instead of bybug. So I'm just going to take out bybug. All right, so now that I've added my pry gem here, anytime I change my gem file, I want to run bundle from the command line. So bundle will look through my gem file and install those gems. And so this should install pry and make sure that it's linked up correctly. All right, so everything is set up now. Let's go ahead and work on our very first feature, which is going to be a songs index page. So the idea of an index page is that it will show you all of something. So in this case, we want a songs index page, which is going to show us all of the songs. So the behavior that we're looking for is we want to go to our app, and our app initially is going to run on localhost 3000. And we want to go to /songs. And this should show us our songs page here. But of course, this isn't quite working yet. So the first thing that we're going to need to be able to do to be able to use our Rails app is to run our Rails server from the command line. So I'll say Rails server here. And so this server is now waiting, and you can even see it's listening on localhost 3000. So I've started my server. It's waiting for some input, like from my web browser. So if I go over here and I refresh, we'll get our first error, which is no route matches get to /songs. So essentially what this error is telling me is I'm trying to visit this page, but our app has not been set up to allow users to see this page. So no route matches get to /songs. The first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go into the routes file. So under config/routes.rb, this is where all of our routes are held. So the route for this is going to be get to /songs. So this is, you can think of this first part as this is accepting the route or accepting the request. So over here, we are trying to send a request to /songs. This code gives us the ability to receive that request, but then we need to say, what do we do with it? So we route it to a controller in action. So we're going to route this to the songs controller and then an index action. So in this routes file, I'm adhering to the Rails routes DSL, which stands for domain specific language. So essentially, I'm just kind of following the rules for how to make a routes file work. So we're not just writing Ruby here, we're writing Ruby within this Rails DSL, Rails routing DSL. Okay, so now we have given it the ability, our app, the ability to receive this request to /songs, and we're trying to route it to this controller action right here. So let's see what happens now. So we're on localhost 3000 /songs. I'm going to hit enter. And now we get a different error for uninitialized constant songs controller. So we got past the first part of routing the request, which was just receiving it. But now we have to figure out what do we do with it? How do we respond to it? So the syntax here is name of the controller and then action of the controller or action inside the controller. So that's why it's saying uninitialized constant songs controller. So what we can do is we can go create one. So we'll go under app controllers and we'll create a new file in here called songs_controller. And it does have to be named like this, snake cased songs, plural songs _ controller. And now that we've made the file, we should be able to go back to our browser and try to visit that same page again. And we'll see that our error is slightly different. So it says unable to auto load songs controller expected, and then this file that I just made, songscontroller.rb, to define it. So what this is telling me is that Rails is looking at the right file, but it doesn't have the class within the file, which would be our songs controller. So now we can go in there and create class songs controller. And this is going to inherit from application controller. So inheriting from application controller is what makes this a controller. Yeah. So now we've got our class in here. Let's go back to our browser and try to visit this page again. And now we get another error. The action index could not be found for songs controller. So we created the controller. We don't have the action inside the controller called index. And action in Rails is really just a method inside the controller. So this is asking us to make an index method inside our songs controller. We'll go back to the browser and we'll refresh. And so now it'll say songs controller index is missing a template for this request format invariant. And the request format is text HTML. Note, for XHR, AJAX, or API requests, this action would normally respond with 204 no content in empty white screen. Since you're loading it in a web browser, we assume that you expect to actually render a template, not nothing. So we're showing an error to be extra clear. If you expect a 204 no content carry on, that's what you'll get from an XHR or API request. Give it a shot. So this is a very long error message. We don't really need to read this every time. It's good to read it once. What this is telling us is that we don't have a view. So it was telling us if you're doing these other types of requests, you would want to show an empty white screen. But in this case, we do not want an empty white screen. What we want is we want to see all of the songs in our database. But we are not seeing that currently. So it's saying we're missing a template. So what we need to do is we need to create the template. So by default, Rails is going to look for this view template under app views. And then it's going to look for a folder inside app views with the same name as our controller, which is songs. So it's going to look under app views for a folder called songs, because we're in a songs controller. So I'll make a folder called songs. And then inside that folder, it's going to look for a file with the same name as our action. So I'm going to make a new file, index. And by convention, I'm going to give this an extension, .html.erb. So this is the template or the view that my app is looking for. So let's refresh the page and see if we get a different error. And we do. Now we get our empty white screen here. So now my Rails app is fully functioning from start to finish. So it was able to receive this request to /songs. And if we look at our running server, remember this server is still running, we can even see it says started get to /songs, processing by songs controller index. So when we visited that page, it hit the routes file first, matched up that request to /songs with this route here, routed it to our songs controller index action, which is what we see in the terminal down here, processing by songs controller index. So it went over to this songs controller index action, saw there was no code in here, so it did nothing, and then rendered by default app views songs index.html.erb. And we can see two different versions. Don't worry about those two different versions. It just rendered a view for us, which was, if I look at my view file, this blank file that I had right here. So then it knew, so the final thing that it did was it returned that blank page back to me in my browser. So that was the full process of Rails receiving a request, processing the request, and sending back a response. And what I get is a blank response. But this isn't what we want. What we want is we want to see all of the songs in our database. So let's do something here. Let's first add in a header, like let's just say songs. So we'll add in some HTML into this view. And if we refresh the page, we should now see that change our view that we're seeing. So now if I just add anything in here, just like type whatever, I should see that pop up in my view now. One error that I didn't see, and I'm gonna stop my server right now. So just keep that in mind. The server is stopped. So now if I try to visit this page, I'll get the site can't be reached, localhost refused to connect. So this is telling me my server is not running, Rails is not running, is not waiting and ready to receive requests. So one error that I didn't see earlier was no database. So let me actually do this. I'll do Railsdb Drop, because this is something that you might see if you're trying to do this. I had already created this database at some point, but you might also run into this error. So let's just drop it. And you'll notice that I did Rails S rather than Rails server. You can do Rails S to abbreviate Rails server. And it seems like I'm getting some errors now. So if I refresh this page, I can see fatal database setlist development does not exist. So this is an error that I'm going to run into if I've never set up this database before. So Rails is going to need a database to connect to. So I can say Railsdb create from the command line. And that will create two databases for me, setlist development and setlist test. It's picking up the name of the database, setlist, from the name of the app, setlist. So if we had named the app something different, this database would be named differently. Okay. So what we want is we want our app to be able to show us all the songs in the database, but we don't currently have a way for our app to store songs in the database. So what we're going to have to do next is we're going to have to create a migration. So a migration is what's going to allow us to alter our database schema, which is the organization of our database. So we're going to need a migration here. So we're going to say Rails generate migration. And we're going to name this migration create songs. So we're creating a migration that's going to create a songs table in our database to allow us to store songs. So we'll say Rails generate migration create songs. And then we can say, what does a song have here? So a song is going to have a name, which is a string. And actually, I think I want this to be a title of a string, a length, which is going to be an integer, and a play count, which is also going to be an integer. So our app is going to keep track of these songs, and each song is going to have a title, length, and play count. So I'll run this command, and it will create this file for me under db migrate. So let's go check out that file. So here's our migration file. This file is instructions for how to change the database. So this is saying, I want to change the database by creating a new table called songs. And in that new table, I'm going to have a string column, which is going to hold the title, or the name of that column is going to be a title. I want to have a length column, which is going to be an integer. And I want to have an integer column, which is going to be the play count. I can also edit this migration file. So for whatever reason, something didn't seem right, I can just change it. And an example of that is adding in this special command here for t.timestamps. So that's going to create two other columns called created at and updated at, which help me keep track of when my records were created and first created and when they were last updated. So I've created the instructions for changing my database, but I also need to run another command here to say, Rails, I want you to execute those instructions. And that command is Railsdb Migrate. So when I run Railsdb Migrate, it's going to look in this migrate folder. And if any migrations have not been run, it's going to run those migrations. So we'll see that in action. So I run Railsdb Migrate, and it says create songs migrating, create table songs, and then it says create songs migrated. You'll also notice that after I run this migration, I have a new file called schema.rb. So if I open this up here, I can see my database schema. So before, when I didn't have any tables created, I didn't have a schema.rb file. Now, once I run a migration to create those files, now I have this schema file, which shows me those tables. And we can see something very similar to what we had in our migration file. So it tells me, this is telling me that I have a songs table with these 3 columns. And here we can see our 2 timestamp columns that we added in. So this is our created at and our updated at date times. So now we have a way to store songs in our database, which is great. But we haven't had a way to, so we have our database is connected to songs, but we have not connected our Rails code to that database. And the way that we connect our Rails and Ruby code to our database is through our models. So our models are going to be the connection to the database. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into app models, and we're going to create a new file here called song.rb. And it is important, this is spelled singular song.rb. And in here, we're going to make a class of song, which inherits from application record. And very similar to how inheriting from application controller makes a controller, inheriting from application record makes this class a model. So now that I have this model file, what can I do with it? Well, I'm going to open up a Rails console session from the command line here. So what the Rails console is going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to interact with this class. So I should be able to say song. And you can see it says call song.connection to establish a connection. So let's try it, song.connection. Okay, something happened. Now let's type in song. And it returns to me this song class, and it tells me all of the columns that I have. So I have ID, title, length, play count, created at, and updated at. We did not add the ID column. Rails just by default will give us that ID column, that primary key column. So what I can do here is I can say song.all, and this should tell me what are all the songs that I have in my database. And that will give me back this empty active record relation, which I can think of as an array. So it's really an empty array. So when I say, hey, song.all, in English, this is give me all of the songs that are in my database. There are no songs. So let's create some. Let's say song.create. And I'm going to tell it inside these parentheses, I'm going to give it keyword arguments, which are going to be all of my song attributes. So let's create a song called, let's call this Chicken Fried, and a length of, doesn't really matter here. And we'll give it a play count of, also doesn't really matter, 12. So when I run this command, we can see some SQL output. We can see begin here, which is the start of my SQL. And it's doing a SQL insert here with this whole command is a SQL insert. And then I see commit here, which is telling me that it successfully made that insertion. And the return value denoted by this fat arrow is a new song object. So now if I do song.all, again, asking what are all the songs in my database, I no longer get an empty array of songs. I now get an array with that new song in there. And if I do a dot length on that, I can see now I have one song in my database. Cool. Let's create another song. So I'll go back to song.create here, and I'll just change some of these values around. So maybe that. And let's do don't stop. So same thing, begin, we inserted a song into the database and it looks like that was successful and it returned to us our new song object. So now if we do a song.all, I should see both songs in this array. And that looks good. And we can run a .length here just to double check. Yes, we do have 2 songs. Okay, great. So we have 2 songs. What do we do with them? Well, remember, what we're trying to do is we are trying to create a web page, an index page specifically, that's going to show us all of those songs. So what I'm going to need to do here is I'm going to run my Rails server again with Rails S. So I'm not going to type Rails server every time. Rails S is a nice abbreviation. So let's go back here. I've created that database already, so we're past this error. So we'll refresh the page. And here's our view that just has that one header on it. What we want is we want this view to also show us all the songs. So what we should do is we should go to the controller. And here is where we're going to use that song.all command. So that same command that we used in the terminal to grab all of the song objects from the database, we can do that in our controller action right here. And I'm actually going to split the screen between the controller and the view. So song.all will allow me to grab all the songs, but I want to pass those to the view so that the view can display them. So the view is what actually the user actually sees here. So the way that I pass data to the view is with instance variables. So by making an instance variable like @songs, I should now be able to access that from my view here. And I can do that with something like this. So I can make an ERB tag, which is going to be a open bracket or a greater than sign, %sign. And I'm going to throw in an equals as well, because I want this to be displayed. And I can say @songs. So the process is we call song.all, grabs all those songs and stores them in an array. We save that to a variable called @songs. That variable is then accessible in the view because it's an instance variable. If this was not an instance variable, like I just take off the @ I would not be able to access this data over here. So we'll leave this as an instance variable. And let's see what my view looks like now. So I was able to pass that data to the view, but look, I'm displaying this as some sort of Ruby object. It's a song active record relation object. So what I want here is I don't want to just display this array. What I want to do is I want to iterate over it with each. So I'll iterate over this with each, and that should give me access to each song. And each block is going to need an end. So I'm going to make another ERB tag. And I'm going to end my block here. And I'm going to take out the equals because I don't want to display this line of code right here, which would be my songs array. I don't want to display this. What I want to display is each individual song. So I'll make this visible and I'll call song.title right here. So going back over to the view, or back over to the browser, refresh this. And now I can see both of my song titles. So I see Chicken Fried and I see Don't Stop Believing. So I'm getting really close to finishing this off. I've got my song data. So I've got a database full of songs. I have set up my Rails app so that we can visit /songs and see a web page where we can see all those song titles. I don't love this formatting though. It's kind of just all on one line. So rather than just showing this data in this HTML page, I want to show this data inside a paragraph tag. So I'll create a paragraph tag and wrap each song title in a paragraph tag, and that should just add a little formatting to it. So now I'll go back over to my web page, hit refresh, and now they're each on their own line. So now I have successfully created an index page. The one more thing I want to do before I move on, the first thing is if you're using Atom, I like to click on this ERB, the file grammar, and change this to HTML Ruby ERB. And I just like this formatting a little better. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is I could add a little bit more formatting here. So I could do something like also add in the songs play count. So song.play count. And I could do something similar for the length, like this. And then if we look at this, that's what the page will look like. Now, this isn't great. It's just kind of like raw data on the page. So let's add in a little bit more formatting here. Let's change this. Let's change the P tag for the title. Let's change this to an H3 tag. And so now if we refresh that, it's just a little easier to read. And then for our pieces of data, they're kind of just numbers just hanging out. There's no real meaning attached to them. So let's attach some meaning. So let's say in front of the ERB tag, so if I'm outside of the ERB tag, I'm writing HTML. Let's say play count, and let's do the same thing for length. And there we go. Now our page is a little bit nicer, a little bit easier to read. There we go. So now that we've got some working code, let's go ahead and push it up to GitHub so that we can share it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to do a git status on my current local repository. And I can see that I've got some changes that I've made. The first thing that I want to do is I want to get this connected to a remote GitHub repository. So let's go over to github.com and let's create that repository. So I'll go ahead and hit new here, and I'm going to create this under Turing School Examples, and we'll call this set list tutorial. We're going to make this public and hit create repository. Cool. So now I've got a remote GitHub repository, but if I go back over to my local Git repository and I do a git remote, I'll see nothing listed. And if I do git remote -v, -v stands for verbose, so this will give you some more information, but it does the same thing. It is confirming for me that there is no GitHub remote repository that this is connected to. So we need to connect these two together. So I'm going to go over to my GitHub repository and copy this SSH key by clicking this little clipboard icon. Go back over to my local repository and we can say git remote add. So this is adding a remote to my local repository. We're going to name it origin, and we're going to connect it to this SSH key, which is pointing to that remote GitHub repository. So now if I do a git remote, I should see my origin listed, and a git remote -v would give me some more information on that origin. It confirms that it's connected to that remote github.com Turing School Examples setlist tutorial repo. All right, so now these two should be connected. Remember at the very beginning, I made that initial commit. So if I do a git log, I can see that one commit in here. So let's go ahead and push that to our origin and the main branch on our origin. And so this all looks successful. It created this new branch of main. So from my local main to my remote main. So now if I go back to my repository on GitHub, I refresh and I see that initial commit listed here, and I see all of that starter code. Okay, so now I've got the repo created and connected. Now I want to add my new code here. So if I do a git status, I can see all of this code that I have either changed, you can see modified, or created. These are untracked files. I don't want to commit directly to the main branch. I want to use a pull request workflow. So I'm going to check out a new branch. So it's okay that I coded while I was on the main branch, as long as I didn't commit anything to the main branch. So let's go ahead and check out. I'll say -b to indicate I'm creating a new branch, and I'll call this, let's call this songs index. So now I'm on a new branch called songs index. Let's commit all of this code to that branch. So if I look at all of these files, these do seem like files I want to add. Gem file is where I added pry. I added in my route. I had to make my model view and controller for this whole feature. And I also had to make a new migration, which changed my schema. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at all of the changes that I've made and confirming, yes, I do want to add them. So if I do want to add all of those, I can say git add dot here. You don't want to say git add dot unless you can confirm that you do want to add everything, which I've already done. So now if I do a git status, now all those files are in green. And so let's go ahead and commit them. So let's say this adds the songs index. And now a git status should show me that I'm on a clean working branch. So now we can push this to our origin. And so we're pushing this to our remote setlist repository, but now we're pushing this to the songs index branch, not the main branch. And I'll say I'm creating a new branch. So now back over here, my GitHub repository picked up that songs index had recent pushes less than a minute ago. And so we can hit this compare and pull request button. This looks good. I don't think I need to add any comments or anything, so I'll just go ahead and create this pull request. And normally I would want to get this reviewed by a teammate or something, but because we're just learning right now, I'll just go ahead and merge this myself. Confirm this merge. And sometimes I might delete the branch, but I do not want to delete this branch just because I want this accessible for students. And so now if I click on code up here on the main branch, now I'll see that add songs index commit is now part of the main branch as well. So then the final thing here, I can check out main, and I can pull from that new updated main branch just to match up my local Git repository with my remote Git repository.